Platformer franchises come and go over the years. During the days of the NES to the N64 or PS1 era, we were given so many different and unique platformer franchises. Of course, you have stuff like your Marios, your Sonics, and your Crash Bandicoots. But then you have the much more smaller stuff like your Gex, your Banjos, and your Tonic Troubles. But if you're deep into the platformer genre like I am, then a character named Klonoa might ring a bell. Released in 1990, Klonoa was a small platformer as you guide this cute little cat, dog, rabbit thing through this magical world where you meet a lot of charming characters. It was received pretty well when it first released, but unfortunately never really got the notoriety compared to the other big mascots. But despite that, Klonoa still found his way with multiple entries for a few years before going on a deep hiatus. Until about, holy crap, 4 years ago when the first two Klonoa games were remastered for modern platforms, so now Klonoa is way more accessible than ever. But going back to the original game, out of all the Klonoa games out there, this is the one I definitely played the most. As the first time I ever actually played this game was with the Nintendo Wii remake because I was a Nintendo Wii kid. As I saw videos of this game online and I was very interested in it, especially with the character design of Klonoa. Although, funniest thing is that originally I was actually planning on getting the original PS1 game, until I saw those prices, said f that, and I saw that there was actually a Wii version of it. Although eventually I was still able to get myself a digital copy of the game as it was actually released on PS3. And the PS1 version is going to be the thing that I'm going to be focusing on for this video. But I am going to be talking about the other two versions of Klonoa the Phantomile, because even though that these two games are basically the same game, they still represent like a big history point for the Klonoa series, for better or for worse. But with everything out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so when you boot up the game, you're greeted to probably the most earwormy jingle I can ever think of. I don't know why, but for some reason when it comes to Klonoa, this single jingle lives in my head rent-free. Like, it's so catchy. Woohoo. But anyway, so the story begins in this weirdly ominous narration about dreams and such, where afterwards we're greeted to Klonoa who's playing around in this dense forest, when all of a sudden a mysterious artifact crashes down from the sky close by to the cat thing. And when Klonoa tries to investigate, he stumbles upon this giant ring where he tries to pull it out with those cute little grunts. But anyway, so the ring comes out and it turns out that a small creature was inhabiting it, which is a cute little floating ball named Hupo. And just like that, the two became best friends instantly, and then suddenly, Klonoa's going to be discovering that being friends with the space creature isn't that crack out to be, because then this happens. This intro is somehow both cute and intense at the same time. But anyway, so as soon as Klonoa wakes up from that strange dream, another thing then suddenly crashes on top of the bell towers. And as Klonoa and Hupo tries to investigate on top of the place, they discover this giant mysterious being who so happens to be the Dark King Gaudius, whose main goal by the looks of this guy's face is to destroy the world with nightmares, but in order to do so, he needs access to the Moon Kingdom, which is this magical land that created the world of Phantomile, but not just that, he also needs to make sure that this mysterious girl named Lafitte stays asleep because she is the key to keep this world healthy. And so without her, no one can stop Gaudius from destroying the world. But luckily that even though that he was able to capture Lafitte, Klonoa was able to find the Moon Pendant, which so happens to be the key to access the Moon Kingdom. And so now it's up to Klonoa to stop this evil being and save the world. The story at first is fairly straightforward, as it's mostly boiled down to Klonoa trying to stop the bad guy. But even with a simple premise like that, the game does a really good job on conveying you like you're going on like this big adventure. As throughout the game, you'll meet plenty of these weird and charming creatures, which truly livens up the world of Phantomile. And I really gotta say, I really love Klonoa's design in this game because he's just very cute to look at, that just makes you go, aww. He's just like my cat, for real, for real. Hupo is also a pretty decent character who really doesn't really have that noteworthy things to say about him before the near end. But he's a pretty nice companion character for Klonoa to hang around, with a design where If I tell someone that this is a Kirby character, they'd probably believe it. The main villains in this game are also pretty cool. Like, throughout the game we have like this cute little clown jester thing named Joka, who is pretty much the comic relief villain in the game, where when Klonoa tries to proceed, you just see this weirdo bubbling around going,
"Egods! How did you get past my impossible platforms?"
And, unironically, Gaudius is a pretty good threatening villain for this game, just for its design and voice alone. Like, this game does have voice acting for a lot of the characters having like this Banjo-Kazooie gibberish, and they're also fairly compressed because this game is released on the PS1, but there's something about that alongside with the distortion to Gaudius' voice that really makes him feel more threatening, especially compared to the other cutesy stuff in this game. Other than that, there are plenty of these smaller characters that shows up only a couple of times within the game. Like in the first level, you meet up with this weird old dude named Baloo, where his main goal in the game is actually trying to get to the Moon Kingdom as well, but he's only doing it because he has completely fallen in love with the goddess of the land, Laphise. And he feels like the only way to actually access the Moon Kingdom is to build a giant tower. I don't understand his thinking process, and honestly, just doing this just so one person can fall in love with you is kind of weird. Alrighty, so jumping all the way to gameplay. So, the best way to describe Klonoa Door to Phantomile is that it is a 2.5D puzzle platformer. Where the main thing is that even though the main gameplay loop in this game is a side-scroller with a 3D graphics look, which is a type of platformer that was kind of new at the time. Like, the only other game I could think of that did that was probably with Kirby 64, which released about 3 years later. But, unlike that game, where the 3D graphics is mostly for show, Klonoa actually fully interacts with the 3D environments in this game, even if its movements lock between two different directions. The actual controls in this game is also pretty simple and pick-up-and-play typey. Of course, since it's a platformer, Klonoa can run and jump and such. And for his weapon of choice, he has this giant magical ring that can shoot out a projectile called a wind bullet. Where, every time Klonoa shoots at an enemy, they will inflate into a freaking balloon where Klonoa can pick them up and toss them around. It's kind of similar to something like Kirby, where you can inhale an enemy and spit them out. But unlike Kirby, you can shoot out the enemy in two different directions. Klonoa can actually throw the enemies in the foregrounds and backgrounds. With the only other game I could think of that did kind of like this is probably with something like Yoshi's Crafted World. But unlike that game where you mostly do it just to collect the various collectibles, Klonoa interacts with the background and such to solve puzzles, as this game has a huge emphasis on exploration. The number of levels in this game isn't really that big compared to other platformers, as Klonoa only has about 12 levels to explore. But unlike something like Super Mario World, where like the average level can take up like 1 or 2 minutes, the average length for a Klonoa level can take up about like 5 to 10 minutes. With the later levels taking me about like 15 to 20 minutes. Which I know on paper would sound like it would drag a lot, but honestly I think they handled it pretty well. With so many different unique secrets in every nook and cranny. And there's even a special collectible for all the levels where throughout the game you'll find these poor villagers that were captured by Gaudius. And if you collect all of them, then this happens. It's all pretty good stuff throughout, and I think the best aspect of Klonoa is that it really makes you feel like you're going on like this big adventure. The story of this game takes a huge focus, with every level in this game proceeds the story even further. Like with the first 2 levels, it's mostly Klonoa just trying to get up to the hill and see what's going on. And when Klonoa discovers Gaudius' plan to try and destroy the world and tells his grandpa about it, he sends Klonoa off to the dense forest to meet up with Granny to tell him how to defeat Gaudius. But unfortunately, the forest that Klonoa needed to go has been fully affected by Gaudius, as the water in the forest has completely dried up, and because of that, all the trees in the area is slowly decaying. As it turns out, is that the area that is basically the source of Phantomile's water is in peril because of Gaudius, and so because of this, Klonoa decides to take a bit of a detour. Damn, he really means it when he wants to destroy this world. Like, you have to be f***ing evil if you want to kill this thing. And then there's the presentation, and I must say, for a PS1 game, Klonoa Door to Phantomile looks pretty good. I really love the aesthetic of this game. Like, I already talked about my high praises about the character designs and how very cutesy they look. But I really like the style they were going with, like how all the characters have like this Donkey Kong Country pre-rendered look. While all the environments in this game is fully 3D, which weirdly reminds me a lot of stuff like Mario & Luigi Dream Team, where even though all the characters in this game are 2D with the environments being 3D, the simple aesthetic for all the areas of this game meshes well with the 2D characters. I especially love how very bright and colorful everything is in this game. But I think the best aspect of this game's presentation is easily with the music, as most of the music in this game has a very peaceful, dreamlike feel to it, with a big focus on wind instruments, which is very fitting for Klonoa. And I like how the soundtrack of this game has a very good variety in terms of tone, where if the scene is very upbeat, the music sounds very peaceful, but when things get very serious, the music really complements that. Especially when you're going up against the various bosses in this game, where I like how even though like 90% of the characters in this game are 2D, these are the only guys that are actually fully 3D, which really makes them feel a lot more imposing than they really are. Especially when we head to the later parts of this game where things become very, very dire. Oh god. Okay, so halfway through the game when Klonoa was finally able to meet up with Granny, she explains to Klonoa on how Ghadius is able to get to the Moon Kingdom, as he needs to bring the Moon Pendant to the Temple of the Sun where it will light the way to the Hidden Palace. Where Klonoa explains is that the Moon Pendant is located at his house with his grandpa, but then that freaking bastard Joka was spying on them, and now he knows the location of the Moon Pendant. Meaning that Klonoa's grandpa is now in danger, and as Klonoa tries his best to race all the way back to his home, Joka uses a giant fucking laser to shoot down at Klonoa's house with his grandpa nearby. And so because of this, Joka now has the Moon Pendant while leaving Klonoa behind to see his grandpa die before his eyes. You know, starting this game, you always get like this very big impression about like, this is just like a very cutesy platformer with all the characters being very cute and charming and such. But halfway through the game, the tone went from a very lighthearted cutesy feel to something very serious and sinister. Like, Joka on first glance seems like the usual like goofy comic relief type of villain like I mentioned earlier, but then suddenly he does this shockingly heinous act where he kills Klonoa's grandpa. And they don't even do like a cop-out in this game where it's like, oh, grandpa's back and such. No, he's actually gone. He actually made Klonoa watch his grandpa breathe his last breath, in a scene that honestly still to this day very gets me. Well, that was pretty upsetting, but despite of the terrible circumstances Klonoa is in, he and Hupo still needs to stop Joka from awakening the Moon Kingdom. And so they head forth to the Temple of the Sun. When the first area, Klonoa and Hupo tries to find their way into the temple itself, while in the second part you are storming within the temple, which, I'll be completely honest, I liked most of the levels in Klonoa Door Phantomile, but out of all of them, I think I can safely say 5-2 is probably my least favorite one. Mostly because it has this annoying day and night cycle where every time it goes into nighttime, all the enemies are completely invulnerable, meaning that you can't pick up or destroy, which really ruins the pacing of what could have been a pretty solid level. But at the very least, it does end things off strong with you actually facing off with Joka, as Klonoa was able to get his comeuppance to Joka for killing his grandpa. Unfortunately, however, even with Joka defeated, Klonoa is too late as Ghadius was able to spawn in the Moon Kingdom. Meaning that Klonoa needs to stop Ghadius quickly, otherwise the entirety of the world will vanish. And this leads to the final areas of Klonoa Door Phantomile, which is in the Moon Kingdom. And I must say, out of all the levels in this game, the Moon Kingdom ones are easily my favorite ones, as it's just the perfect kind of levels for a Klonoa game. Visually speaking, this area looks freaking beautiful. Like, I really love how it's all set in like the nightly sky. And I always find the shimmering floors Klonoa was running around very mesmerizing. Really nails the feel like you're actually exploring like a secret hidden world full of magic. And this is also when the plot of this game really gets interesting, as halfway through the Moon Kingdom you are confronted with the ruler of the area, and it turns out in a shocking twist is that Hupo was actually the prince of the Moon Kingdom this entire time, as Hupo reveals Klonoa his true form. Klonoa asks Hupo why did he hide himself into that little ball form, with Hupo not really giving him a good answer, only telling him just to trust him for a little bit longer. With Klonoa obliging to Hupo's request, because after all, they've been good friends for so many years. And so afterwards you head forth to the final level, where in this area it basically tests all your platforming skills that you learn throughout the entire game. The platforming challenges here are basically perfect, the puzzles are actually pretty good, and I love how the main theme of the music is basically a remix version of the very first jingle you hear in this game. It's a pretty good send-off before heading to the final boss, as Klonoa was able to finally face off with Ghadius. Before he does so, Ghadius begins to monologue about something very weird in Phantomile. As he puts it, there's like this strange dream within the areas that he cannot corrupt at all. And so before he can actually destroy the world of Phantomile, he needs to get rid of this strange dream. But Klonoa is not going to let Ghadius do anything, as Klonoa is going to be defeating Ghadius once and for all. And after throwing random shit at the evil king, he then suddenly goes down. But you're not done yet, because even though that you defeated Ghadius, the evil demon that he was trying to wake to destroy the Phantomile has finally been created. And so, Klonoa, alongside with all the friends he met along the way, tries to head forth to stop this evil being from destroying their home. And so the true final battle begins. Now, unlike the other enemies in the game where you mostly have to throw it at the enemy's weak spot, but for the final boss in this game, Klonoa cannot actually harm the boss at all. And so instead, Klonoa's allies have these special cannons that actually is the thing that will deal damage to the boss. So the real challenge to the final boss is actually loading up the cannon so your allies can shoot the final boss down. You do this for a couple of phases, and then the monster becomes completely weakened, which allows Klonoa and Hupo to do the final blow. And so just like that, the monster is defeated and Phantomile has been completely saved. However, this game decides to pull one final gut-wrenching twist at the end of this game. So you know how I mentioned Ghadius was monologuing about like a strange dream within Phantomile? Well, it turns out Klonoa himself was that dream. Yeah, so it turns out that Klonoa doesn't really exist in Phantomile. Hupo actually summoned Klonoa to this world. Klonoa obviously doesn't really believe that because he has so many memories within Phantomile with Hupo. But then Hupo explains is that all the memories Klonoa had over the years were fake, as he's the one that conjured up these artificial memories in his head. So basically, the house that Klonoa lives in wasn't really his home, and his grandfather wasn't really his grandfather, it was just a stranger that was pretending to be Klonoa's grandpa. Hupo did all this just so he can have Klonoa's trust, as Klonoa's big purpose in Phantomile was trying to save it. And so once Lafitte sings her song, everything will go back to normal, meaning that Klonoa will be forced to leave this world because he does not belong here. Which really makes Klonoa completely devastated, and honestly, I cannot blame him at all. Like, he believes that he grew up here just because of Hupo's manipulation. And the fact that he knew that the moment the world is saved, Klonoa is being forced to leave in a world where he believes that he lives there. But unfortunately, the deed is done as Lafitte begins to sing her song to restore Phantomile. And just like that, a portal in the sky then begins sucking up Klonoa, where he tries this as all to try and stay with Hupo trying to keep him here. And holy crap, the near end when Hupo desperately tries to hold on to Klonoa, that honestly really got me, because even though that Hupo was lying the entire time, you could clearly tell that he was actually connected with Klonoa. But unfortunately, as much as they try, Klonoa's fate is sealed as he gets sucked up into the portal, where he heads to a different world. Ending things off with the Phantomile being fully restored. And that concludes this game. Yeah, that's how the game freaking ends. It ends in such a beautifully sad way. It's just like, Klonoa Door to Phantomile is just one of those video game endings I still think about to this very day, because it's just a shockingly gut-wrenching ending. Especially when you compare it to the other mascot platformers out there. But yeah, that was Klonoa Door to Phantomile, and overall, even to this very day, this game holds up extremely well. It may not be like the biggest or most complex platformer in the world, but despite that, I still find this game extremely replayable, as once every year I try to replay this game as much as I can. Because even if you exclude all like the emotional baggage this game contains, it's still a pretty fun and cozy kind of platformer to play. Honestly, if you're a big fan of platformers and such, I highly recommend playing Klonoa. You can actually get it for a pretty good price these days on digital platforms. Although with that being said, I feel like it's very appropriate to wrap things up with talking about the different Klonoa re-releases. Because as I said earlier, even though that Klonoa Door to Phantomile received very well reviews, it unfortunately fell short in terms of sales and such. Which honestly isn't really too surprising considering the fact that 50% of Klonoa's marketing in the West is mostly jokes about AIDS. But Susan, I have Klonoa. Hey baby, I want Klonoa. But despite that, Namco still kept Klonoa afloat for a few years. As within 5 years, Namco would release a whopping 6 different Klonoa games throughout, with one console sequel on the PS2, while the rest was relegated to stuff like handhelds like the Game Boy Advance. And then after that, Klonoa would eventually fade into obscurity for a few years. But then a few years later, Bandai Namco decided to try and revive the Klonoa series. And so to test the waters, they contracted a new studio to remake the original Klonoa game. And the studio would so happen to be Payon, which is a Japanese studio that I'm actually familiar with. As during the 2000s, while the Donkey Kong series was struggling, this is the company that was basically keeping the series afloat for a few years. And on the plus side, this Klonoa remake is also going to be releasing exclusively for the Nintendo Wii. Which honestly is a very good idea, because Klonoa 1 was always like a very fun pick up and play type of game. And the Wii was already known for being a very casual console, so I think this is all going to be working out pretty well. Like, I do not see this going wrong.
Wahoo! Get ready for an exciting adventure as you help Klonoa save Phantomile, a magical world created by everyone's dreams. Use the wind bullet to grab your enemies and wave your Wii.
Yeah, sales-wise, Klonoa Wii sold freaking terrible. So terrible, in fact, Bandai Namco decided to abandon Klonoa completely for literally a decade until the Phantasy Reverie series. Which honestly is a real shame, because honestly, despite some of the issues, Klonoa on Wii is frankly a pretty solid way to experience the original PS1 classic. Like, again, this is how I actually played Klonoa for the first time. Although I must say, even though like I saw little footage of like the PS1 version, I did have a bit of a big whiplash when it comes to the Wii version. Okay, so I'm not really going to take too long for this because, again, this is just the same game but on Wii. But I will go over some of the big difference between this and the PS1 version. For one, all the pre-rendered cutscenes in this game has been replaced with in-game ones, which I'll give credit when credit's due. The cutscenes in this game were remade pretty faithfully. And that's doubly so for all the characters and environments. Gone are the 2D sprites, and instead all the characters in this game are rendered in full 3D now. The controls in this game is honestly pretty good. Honestly, in some aspects, I actually prefer this than the original. Because with the PS1 version, Klonoa controls very good for the most part, with the only exception being like this weird traction he has, where every time you stop running, Klonoa for some reason slips around for a bit like he's on ice or something. But for the Wii version, that's basically not an issue. However, even though like most of the controls and level design here is basically identical, they did adjust a few things that kind of makes this game a bit easier than the PS1 version. For one, Klonoa's wind bullet now has a bit of a bigger range than the original. And also, this game gives you about 5 health points instead of the original 3. Not really a big deal for me personally per se, but I do feel like I should at least acknowledge it. Now, when it comes to like the actual issues with this Wii remake, it's mostly with stuff like the aesthetic of the game. As well as some of the characters in the game feel very faithful to their PS1 version design-wise. But on the other hand, I feel like some of the character designs here feel a bit worse as well. I don't know how to describe this, but for some reason a lot of the weird characters in this game feels a bit more humanoid than usual. And that's especially the case with Klonoa himself, who is rocking a brand new design very unique for this remake. Funniest thing is that you can clearly tell that Bandai Namco was trying their best to try and broaden Klonoa's audience. I mean, hell, originally they were planning on redesigning Klonoa even more significantly than what we got. And for the actual design that we do have, I think it's a fine enough design for Klonoa. Even if it looks like that Klonoa is wearing a Sora cosplay or something. But my problem with the design isn't really the design itself, but more so the context of this game. As you can clearly tell for the Wii version of Klonoa, his design is mostly based on his Klonoa 2 design where he's a lot older. But with the first ever game, Klonoa was only just a kid. And so because of that, a lot of his mannerisms and such is very kid-like. And his original design and Phantomile complement that very well. I just feel like this Wii remake doesn't really fit Klonoa in this game at all. I feel like the design would have worked better for original Klonoa title. Because all the cutesy moments that Klonoa originally did, like playing with the butterfly, doesn't really land with this design at all. And that's especially the case with Klonoa's new voice in this game. As alongside with a brand new look, Klonoa also fully speaks in English.
Wahoo! Come on, let's go! I'm Klonoa from Wind Village. Okay, we'll see what we can do.
This is not really an attack on the voice actors per se, because I feel like acting-wise, I think they did a fine enough job voicing these characters. But I feel like this voice doesn't really fit Klonoa at all. It honestly sounds like Klonoa is going through puberty right now. But luckily, if you really don't like the English voice acting, they do have an option for you to change all the voices back into the Phantomile gibberish, which includes Klonoa's original voice actor reprising her role. But yeah, if you could really overlook like those minor things in terms of like aesthetics and such, again, I feel like Klonoa Wii is a fine enough way to play the original game.
Klonoa is coming to Nintendo Switch.
Alrighty, so after Klonoa basically crashed and burned on the Nintendo Wii, that will be the final time we would ever see Klonoa for more than a decade. Which honestly really sucked because the Klonoa series had so much great potential. But luckily, during the 2020s, there would finally be a bit of a light in the tunnel. As during this time, Bandai Namco was doing a lot of releases of their older games. As Namco revitalized a lot of their older stuff like the Pac-Man World games, Mr. Drill, and even Katamari. And yes, one day during a random Nintendo Direct, Nintendo would announce Klonoa Phantasy Reverie series, which is a compilation pack which contains Klonoa 1 and 2. And I'll be honest, I think this release alone kinda saved the series for a lot of people. It may be just a simple compilation pack, but keep in mind, this was the first time that Klonoa 1 and 2 were fully accessible for the first time in years, especially with Klonoa 2, which was only ever released on the PS2. I actually really wanted to try Klonoa 2 for the longest time, but I couldn't because I had a painfully bad time with PS2 emulators. So this Klonoa compilation is a freaking godsend. And so now that this game was able to release on modern platforms, you can now play it on your Nintendo Switch, Nintendo Switch 2, PS5, Xbox, and even Steam. I actually played through this game on my Nintendo Switch 2 via backwards compatibility, and holy crap, look how fast it is to actually load into the game. It's not even a half a minute long until you're instantly playing through a level in Klonoa. But anyway, so for this version of Klonoa Door to Phantomile, so unlike the Wii version where that one was made from the ground up, the Phantasy Reverie version is actually a remastered version of the Wii remake. So all the in-game cutscenes from the Wii version basically returns in this one, but they've been updated. So even though like this game uses the skeleton in the Wii version, the art direction, including all the character models, have been completely remade from scratch. So now every character in this game is basically a lot more faithful to the original PS1 version, which includes Klonoa. And I cannot be more happy than that because just look at him. He's so fluffy. The dialogue and voice lines in this game also got big overall from the Wii version. You know, looking back at that remake, shockingly, Klonoa barely talks in that game compared to the original PS1 version, as it was mostly Hubo doing a lot of the talking. But jumping all the way to the Nintendo Switch version, the dialogue is a lot more closer to the PS1 version as well. In fact, most of the voice lines in this game have been ripped from the PS1 version, which honestly does stick out a bit because you can clearly tell like the voice lines are very compressed. But at the same time, I don't really care because I find it very charming. But other than that, there's really not that much I can really say about this version because it's Klonoa Door to Phantomile, but now in HD. I will say though, out of all the versions of Klonoa out there, I think this is probably going to be my preferred version, just because one, it's on Nintendo Switch, so I'll be playing on this a lot more. And second, I love how this version basically takes a lot of the great elements from the original PS1 game, as well as some of the good elements from the Wii remake, and combine them together to make a pretty good version of Klonoa Door to Phantomile. Like seriously though, I cannot recommend enough for you to get the Phantasy Reverie series, as it is easily the best and most accessible way to get into the Klonoa series. And who knows, considering the fact that this game is sold pretty well for Klonoa standards, I actually believe we might get a new Klonoa game one of these days. I mean, with something like the Pac-Man World remake, that game sold pretty well to the point where we got a follow-up with Pac-Man World 2 repack. And then a few years ago we got that Katamari re-release, and then a few years later we would get a brand new game. So, who knows? But even if it takes like a very long time for us to actually see Klonoa again, at the very least I am very grateful that Bandai Namco gave us this re-release. It may have taken a very long time, but it's very nice to see that Klonoa at the very least has a place to stay on modern platforms. But that'll do for today, so thank you for watching and I'll see you later. Bye bye!